comes science. They might be giants. Here comes science.
Hi, Dr. H here. This lesson will be going over the first half of photosynthesis, otherwise known as the light reactions. So the overall photosynthetic equation is shown above. So the process of photosynthesis involves taking CO2 from the atmosphere and combining that with water in the presence of light energy and producing the most important product here is sugar. In this equation, it's labeled as glucose, though, as we'll learn in part 2 of photosynthesis, that's not actually the direct product of photosynthesis. And also very important to us as animals that live on Earth, oxygen gas is given off as a waste product of photosynthesis. And this oxygen is pretty much useless for the plant or the whatever photosynthetic organism it is, but it's very important for aerobic organisms such as our cells. And it's important to remember that plants are not the only photosynthetic organism. There's algae, which also do photosynthesis. I think the bulk of photosynthesis also is actually done by marine algae. And there's lots of bacteria, which can also perform photosynthesis. And altogether, these organisms are called autotrophs, and that means literally means that they make their own food. So they do not have to go out and ingest or eat other organisms to provide them with energy. They make their own chemical energy. And the other sort of big group of organisms are called the heterotrophs, of which animals like ourselves are a member. And these heterotrophs get their chemical energy from ingesting or eating other organisms. And there's this big, kind of circle of energy kind of thing going on here where photosynthesis, the autotrophs produce the organic molecules and the oxygen for the heterotrophs, which eat them, and then in turn the heterotrophs release carbon dioxide, which is used by the autotrophs again. We also certainly provide lots of fertilizer especially for plants to help them survive. So, photosynthesis. First I want to talk about some of these structures involved. So, photosynthesis takes place in the leaves of the plant. And leaves are specially designed for photosynthesis. They have a nice flat structure, which gives them lots of surface area, lots of opportunity for the sunlight to hit it and for that energy to be absorbed. And some of the important structures, kind of going from the outside of the leaf in. First we come to the cuticle, which is sort of on the very outside, the top, and also here on the bottom. And that's sort of this waxy layer which covers the leaf and prevents water loss. Okay, it's a waterproof barrier, kind of like coating your hands in Vaseline, which sounds kind of gross, but that would keep all of the moisture in. The cuticle performs the exact same function. And then there's the epidermis, which is there's both an upper and a lower epidermis. And this is the first layer of cells. You can kind of see it right there. Okay, and this is the epidermis, very similar to the epidermis found on our cells. It's like a skin layer. It's very tightly packed cells, very close together. Okay, and that will also help prevent some water loss. And then in the middle, there's this layer of cells called the mesophyll layers, and it's divided into two different types. The palisade mesophyll, which is these cells going straight up and down, kind of tight next to each other, and then there's the spongy mesophyll, which has a lot more air spaces in between. And these mesophyll cells, you can kind of see in the diagram here, these cells are packed with chloroplasts, which are the photosynthetic organelle. So this mesophyll layer is where the bulk of the photosynthesis will be happening. Okay, and these are the cells that are really, really green, if you look at a leaf under the microscope. Vascular bundles not shown in this diagram very well, but those are the veins that run through the leaf. Okay, if you look at a leaf, hold it up to the light, you can see the network of veins in there. They are there to transport materials all around the plant. And finally, usually in the very bottom, there's these openings called stomata. The single form is stoma. And these are little pores that allow for gas exchange. This is where the CO2 gas would come in for photosynthesis to occur, and it's also where the oxygen gas, the waste, is released. So as I said, the chloroplast is the photosynthetic organelle, so we should know a little bit about the structure of that. There are two membranes which surround the chloroplast, so we call it a double membrane. There's the internal membrane and the external membrane. Sometimes they're also referred to as the outer membrane and the inner membrane. Okay, that's fairly self-explanatory, right? One's on the outside, one's on the inside. And then filling the chloroplast is sort of this kind of analogous to the cytoplasm of the cell. Kind of like the cytoplasm of the chloroplast is the stroma. So this, when we talk about, when we get to part 2 of photosynthesis, we'll talk about some reactions which are occurring out here in the stroma. Today, we will be staying mainly in these two structures, the thylakoids and the grana. So thylakoid is one of these little discs here, and these are little membrane-bound discs. Okay, they're like, kind of think of them like little pancakes, but they're made out of membrane, just like the cell membrane. And the thylakoids arrange themselves in stacks. Okay, and a stack of thylakoids is called a granum. And the plural of granum is grana. So this is one granum here, and all of these together are lots and lots of stacks of grana. So I've mentioned before that this is part 1 of photosynthesis. These are the light-dependent reactions, or just the plain light reactions. There's also a second set of reactions called the light-independent, sometimes also referred to as the dark reactions. And these two reactions are linked together. They're both part of photosynthesis. So we will be talking about this part right here today. Okay, so this part takes the light energy and water and produces two molecules here, two high energy molecules, and then these two molecules feed into the second set of reactions, the light independent reactions, or Calvin cycle, where CO2 comes in, and that actually makes the sugar. So we're not going to actually be making sugar in this set of reactions here. We are just making these two high energy products that will go and power the sugar making reactions down here. All right, so here are the light reactions. Everything here, as I said, happens on the thylakoid. So this here is the thylakoid membrane. So all of these proteins here are all embedded into the thylakoid membrane. This is the inside of the thylakoid here, and this is outside in the stroma up here on this side. You can see the label here. So let's talk about what exactly happens. So we'll start over here with light coming in. So a photon of light comes in, and light has lots and lots of energy, and it strikes this big complex of proteins and other molecules here called photosystem 2. It's abbreviated PS2 here. So in this photosystem, there's lots and lots of molecules. The ones that you really need to remember are the chlorophylls. Okay, chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B. Those are the molecules which absorb the light energy. Okay, and when that light energy is absorbed, it's kind of passed around amongst a bunch of different molecules inside the photosystem, but it eventually ends up with, or the energy eventually ends up as an electron. And that electron is now a high energy electron. So the electron is, or the energy is passed from light to this electron. The electron starts bouncing around inside the photosystem because it's so excited by the light energy that it just captured. So eventually this electron gets kicked out. It gets bumped out of the photosystem. It's just too high energy. It can't stay in there. And it gets passed on to this series of proteins here, all within the thylakoid membrane. And this series of proteins is called the electron transport chain, or ETC. The exact names of all of these proteins are not terribly important. They're not important at all. What is important is that they function together in this chain, in this line, and they pass the electron between them. And as that electron is passed from the first one to the second one to the third one, it gives up some of its energy. Okay, the electron gives up some of its energy to these electron transport carrier proteins. These electron transport proteins also have a second function, in that they are able to pump hydrogen ions against the concentration gradient. So hydrogen ions are being pumped into the thylakoid inner space, the lumen it's called. So inside the thylakoid, there's a very, very high concentration of these hydrogen ions. Out here, there's a very low concentration. So that is going against the concentration gradient. So that is an active form of transport. And the energy for that active transport comes from these electrons, which are being passed down the chain and giving up a little bit of their energy along the way. Okay, so finally, the electron reaches the end of the transport chain, and it comes to this next big complex of molecules called photosystem 1. Okay, so photosystem 2 is first, and then photosystem 1. The reason that 2 comes first is because photosystem 1 was identified first, so they called it PS1, and then after they worked on it for a little bit, they realized that it was second in line, and they just never went back and renamed it. So we have photosystem 1 here that accepts this low energy electron. But in order to have room for this electron to come in, another electron has to be moved out. And that electron is moved out again by the chlorophyll molecules absorbing the energy from a photon of light and exciting an electron, and this electron right here leaves, and that gives room for this electron that was passed through the chain to come in and take its place. So this electron now from PS1 goes into this very, very short electron transport chain. And again, don't worry about the names of these molecules. You don't need to worry about that. But you do need to know this molecule right here. Okay, this electron from photosystem 1 goes and becomes part of this molecule, NADPH. This molecule is a high energy electron carrier, and this is going to carry that electron in this high energy state into the next set of reactions. This is one of the 2 high energy molecules that are the products of the light reaction. The other high energy product of the light reaction is over here, and that is the molecule ATP. And this molecule is the main energy molecule of the cell. And it's also required in the second half of photosynthesis. So this ATP molecule is made through a process called chemiosmosis. And this big membrane-bound protein complex here, ATP synthase, is responsible for making ATP. So we talked back here about the hydrogen ion gradient, how you have very high hydrogen ions inside here and very low hydrogen out here. and that is maintained by this pump here after photosystem 2. So ATP synthase functions as sort of a channel protein to allow the hydrogen ions to diffuse back out into the stroma. And that diffusion is, of course, going down the concentration gradient. It's going from high concentration in here to low concentration out here. As it does that, as it travels down the gradient, it releases the energy that was used to create that gradient. And ATP synthase is able to capture that energy that's being released and use it to create ATP. And it does that by taking this ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, and linking a phosphate group to it to make adenosine triphosphate, which has 3 phosphate groups. Okay, so it uses this hydrogen ion gradient. Hydrogen's flowing down the gradient, releasing energy. The energy is captured by ATP synthase, and ATP is produced. And that hydrogen ion gradient came back here from photosystem 2 and the electron transport chain pumping the hydrogens into the inner space of the thylakoid, and then they diffuse back out to the stroma. Okay, so we have one more thing we need to finish up, and that is back here, way back here at the beginning at photosystem 2. And remember, we had excited this electron and it had left the photosystem. Well, now there's a little spot there where the electron should be. Okay, and we need to fill that in. Can't just leave this little electron-sized hole inside photosystem 2, or else once all the electrons left, photosynthesis would shut down. So we need to replace that electron, and that is done through this reaction here, which is written kind of incompletely, but and this is called the splitting of water. So a water molecule is split in half, basically, to oxygen gas and a hydrogen ion. So the hydrogen ion goes out here and contributes to the gradient. The oxygen leaves as waste gas. And there's one more thing that comes out of the water that is not really shown very well in this diagram, and that is an electron. Okay, and the electron goes in here. The electron goes in here and takes the place of the one that got excited and left. So the splitting of water functions to replace the electron in photosystem 2 that got excited and was kicked out. Okay, and then the oxygen leaves as waste, and the hydrogen, again, is part of the hydrogen ion gradient. Okay, so overall, this scheme of the light reactions is sometimes referred to as the Z scheme. So this is just a kind of a schematic version of the reactions, and if you kind of turn it on its side, you can kind of sort of make out a letter Z here, sort of maybe. So that's why they call it the Z scheme. Okay, but what the important things to remember is the path of the electrons. Okay, from photosystem 2, they get excited by the light. They get passed along this electron transport chain, which takes that energy from the excited electron and pumps hydrogen across the membrane into the thylakoid, where there's already a pretty high concentration. So that's active transport. The electron then ends up in photosystem 1, where more light comes in and excites another electron, and that high energy electron becomes part of this molecule NADPH, which is one of the high energy products of the light reactions. The other high energy product is ATP, and that is made by ATP synthase by taking the energy from the hydrogen ion gradient created over here and allowing hydrogen to diffuse back down, back out of the thylakoid, and the energy is captured as ATP. So those are the light reactions, And when we get to the dark reactions, the Calvin cycle, we will see these two molecules again, ATP and NADPH. So I hope that helps. Hope it made sense.
Dropping science like Galileo dropped the orange.